Okay, today I'm going to look at some fencing with sword and buckler in the system of George Silver. And basically Silver says that you should use your buckler like you use your dagger, and he says you should use your dagger like you use your open hand. So basically buckler is an extension of grappling, and as such he is intending for it to be primarily a sword fight, with the buckler very much a secondary item, and that's very much what we found when we fence. If we focus on the buckler, we tend to get hit a lot more than if we focus on the sword. So the first exchange between myself and Bennett McComish, Bennett's currently probably my best sword and buckler fencer. Bennett starts his attack, and if you look closely here you can see that he's actually starting his body forward a little bit, and it appears like he's in a false time. But Bennett's quite a bit taller than me, and if you watch my earlier video on when a false time's not a false time, tall people can get away with this, where they can start the body moving, because what makes a false time is only what happens as you break distance. So you can see that the moment he starts to get close to distance, he brings his hand before his body, exactly as Silver tells you to. He initially looks like he's cutting quite high, and then he deviates to come in low, and he actually fools me a bit. I actually think he's going lower than he is, because you can see at the point of contact I've actually parried quite a way up the blade. That would be quite a bit better if I parried him closer to my hilt. I would have got more leverage. So my parry isn't really good. It's enough to protect me, but it isn't really good. Now if I'd been smart here, I would have just given up at that point and not tried for a riposte. But what I do here is I sweep his sword down out of the way, and then I raise my hand to do a riposte. And as I raise my hand, he's actually in a pretty good position. He's almost his feet are in a horrible position, but his hand is in almost like a forehand ward position, or a later outside guard. So as I raise my arm, he's actually in a perfect position to strike it as I come up, essentially through a guarded position. So even though I would normally have the tempo in this situation, because I'm the one who's made the parry, my parry wasn't good. I actually lost more time doing the parry than he did by being parried, which is not normally the case. Okay, the second hit commences. So the second hit we can see here, I'm circling to the left, which is what Silver tells you to do when you're in true guarded. And Bennett starts to launch an attack, and you can see that he's come in. He hasn't really crossed his feet. So when he starts to launch his attack, he's trying to sucker me into making too large an action. So he hasn't passed. He's just made a little bit of a step, and he's doing a very, very lackluster cut, which I end up parrying in almost like a later St George ward, with a horizontal blade. Now what he wants me to do is he wants me to do an immediate riposte, and he's going to try to snipe my arm. But he's been a little bit obvious with what he's done. So rather than do an immediate riposte, I prime for the riposte. He's slipping back, he's waiting for me to do it, and then he's raising his arm to strike me, and bang, I come through and hit him on the arm. Okay, so both of us are trying to sucker the other one into leaving their arm dangling out. You can see Bennett's covering the inside of his arm with his buckler very nicely, but isn't covering the outside of the arm, which is why I targeted that. Looking at the third sequence, I move into what is essentially a 133 long point, and I could go into an argument about why I think that the guards of variable fight, when you add a buckler into the situation, should be held a bit differently to the way Silver tells you to hold them with sword alone. But basically I'm in something akin to a 133 long point, and Bennett crosses this and he starts to manipulate my sword. He starts to push my sword to the inside, and I'm going, yeah, all right, you push it to the inside, I'll attack to the outside. Now I pass forward with my rear leg, I launch a cut to his outside, but this is exactly what he wants me to do. Right? He then parries with an outside forehand ward, which he does here, and immediately he does that parry, he riposts. Now I see that he's riposting. I track around and realise I'm not going to be able to parry him immediately, so I slip back to try to get him to miss me and try to countercut to his arm. Unfortunately, he does two things. He gets his buckler in the way of my countercut, and as you can see here, I'm only halfway through my slip when he strikes me across the belly. So both of us had good plans, but Bennett's worked out better. Looking at the fourth sequence, I've added a lot. I've kept a lot of stuff in here because there was quite a long sequence here where we're doing parries and ripostes, and it was quite nice. And then we get to a point where I start to advance and I roll into true garden. So I'm trying to do what Silver says that he says the only way that you can gather within distance is in garden. So basically, I'm coming into garden, and Bennett sees this and he retreats. So what I'm trying to do is sort of smother up any potential attack that he could make, and then I'll essentially be able to set myself up for something akin to a riposte. But what Bennett does is he sees what I'm doing and he slips back. So as I then raise my arm to attack him as he's going back, he then countercuts. Now I attempted to get my buckler in the way, and my buckler's covering about half of my arm, but clearly not all of it, because he slots his sword through the fairly small gap that I've left and hits me inside of the forearm. So you can see that I've complained that I made a false time, and essentially Bennett has turned this into a false time by slipping back. So it was a deliberate move to come in under garden, as Silver says you can do. But remember that Silver says that you'll no sooner be there than you'll wish yourself out again. So once it didn't immediately work, I should have immediately slipped back out, as Silver tells you to do, rather than to continue to come in, which very definitely made it into a false time. The final sequence that we've got here is a very long sequence. We fought for a total of about 11 minutes, which was a very long bout. And this is probably the longest exchange that we have. So I've left quite a bit of the fencing in because it's quite nice. But we get to a point where around about here, where Bennett comes in. If you look at this in slow motion, it's really quite subtle. Bennett comes in and he just tilts his hand ever so slightly to the left, so his point drops down to the right, and then he changes it around. So, but he's that little movement of his hand to the left, and that tiny movement of his point down to the right, has made me think that what he's doing is he's cutting to my inside. So I move my sword across to the inside to parry it. He immediately cuts around to the other side. Now I attempt to get my buckler across, and I very nearly get there, but not quite in time, and he collects me to the outside of the head just before my buckler gets there. So it's a really nice, subtle deception, and Bennett should be really pleased with that. It was a really nice exchange and ended with a really nice deception that I fell for hook, line and sinker. So, a few exchanges with sword and buckler. Hopefully that helps you to see what's going on and how the system works. Thanks for watching.